Hello and welcome to the first tutorial on WOV. This series will cover everything related to this creative tremolo, from the basics of amplitude modulation to more experimental stuff. Okay, let's get into it. We call tremolo an effect that continuously changes our sound's amplitude, which means how loud we perceive it. In its most primitive form, applying a tremolo to a sound equals to manually raising and lowering the fader knob on our mixer. While doing this slightly dull and not that useful operation, we can make a large variety of choices. We can choose, for example, how much the amplitude must change, how fast, and also in which way, like for example, increasing fast and decreasing slow. These choices reflect the main parameters of WOV, which involve the depth of our modulation, the rate, and the shape of the waveform. However, since we are humans, if we manually change a signal's amplitude, we end up being imprecise other than bored. With the tremolo effect, we can thus generate an endless and repetitive amplitude modulation. Since we are using a DAW, we can graphically represent what the tremolo does to our sound through volume automation. For example, this track has a slow volume automation. It covers the whole fader range, and it goes up and down with two straight, equal lines. If it were a tremolo, we could say that it would have a slow rate, a deep modulation amount, and a triangular shape. This other track's modulation, on the other hand, is faster. It doesn't move the fader too much, and it pushes it up faster than it pulls it down. If it were a tremolo, we would say that it will have a fast rate, a shallow modulation amount, and a sawtooth shape. Apart from being still very tedious to program, these automations has a huge difference from a real tremolo effect. They aren't endless, but they are limited to our will to carry them on. On the other hand, a real tremolo is endless, continuously running in the background regardless of our track's length. This will have some significant advantages that we will see later on. Now it's time to put everything into practice and begin to know WOV hands-on. The first parameter that we need to get acquainted with is the depth one. It controls the balance between the pure sound and its modulated version. It's like WOV duplicated the sound and modulated just its copy, allowing you to do some easy parallel processing tricks. However, the depth parameter does not control the modulation amount, which is how wide is the amplitude variation, even though the result might seem the same. The parameter devoted explicitly to the modulation amount is the multislider. Every slider defines the amount of a single modulation cycle, like moving our volume fader up and down once. If we select only two sliders and set them to the same level, all of our modulation cycle will have the same amount. The fun begins when we activated more sliders. Now we are able to have a sequence of modulation cycles, all with their amplitude variation. You can hear that sometimes the modulation is wider and some other is quieter. You can also see that when a slider is set to its lower position, the modulation cycle will be completely silent. To control how fast the modulation is running, we use the rate parameter. We rotate the knob clockwise to increase the speed and counterclockwise to decrease it. The value is expressed in Hertz, which indicate how many full cycles happen within a second. Remember, we can talk about cycles because we have said that WOV's modulation is always running. But there is more. With the sync control, we can set WOV to work in sync with our DAW's clock. If we activate this behavior, we will see that the rate knob gets replaced by a time signature. We can now define each cycle's duration in musical terms, which is extremely useful to achieve rhythmic structures. Let's see how it sounds like against a beat. The N letter stands for nominal value, the D letter stands for dotted note, and the T stands for couplets. In other words, Hertz allows us to control WOV's rate in absolute terms, while the sync parameters expresses a relative duration that will change according to our project's tempo. The third key parameter of any tremolo is the waveform shape, which we can think of as a graphical representation of a complete modulation cycle from its lowest point to its highest peak and back. In practical terms, the tremolo shape defines how the amplitude changes over time. In these examples, tracks 1 and 2 have a WOV set to work at the exact same note duration. Their effect, however, is completely different, and this is because of the waveform shape. Let's see how to master this control in WOV. There are three controls to change WOV's tremolo shape: wave, peak, and warp. The wave parameter defines if our shape will be smoother or sharper. At its leftmost position, our wave will be a sort of sinusoid, smooth and fluid. We gently rotate it clockwise to sharpen it until you reach the rightmost position, where it will be a sort of square wave. We can use the smoother waves when we want a gradual change in amplitude and we want to fully appreciate the sweep transition. On the other hand, sharper waveforms are very useful to create a more chopped effect with a distinctively rich and energetic sound. The warp control defines the proportion between sound and silence within each modulation cycle. In other words, how thin or wide the wave must be. This tool allows us to define our sound character precisely, making it very snappy, like this, or more relaxed, like this other one. The third and last parameter is the peak one. It basically moves the highest amplitude point, which is our waveform peak, around the period. In its central position, we have this sort of sine or square wave that we have seen thus far. By moving it to the left, we shift the point of maximum energy towards the beginning of our waveform, while rotating the knob to the right shifts it towards the end. Another way of thinking about it is an attack and release control, since it defines how fast our sound should fade in and out. We can obtain many different behaviors by combining these three parameters, such as chord stabs or bass side chains. WOV is a stereo effect, meaning that it can process the left and right channels of our track independently, either to preserve or to alter the original stereo image. In this example here, we stuck together two different synthesizer parts, we panned them on the left and right channel, and we routed them through WOV. Now we can hear that the amplitude modulation is always relative to the original left and right sound volume. However, if we activate the stereo control, we allow WOV to do some clever tricks with our stereo placement. Many of them affect some parameters that we will see in the next episode of this series, except one, the offset. When the stereo mode is on, we can choose to shift back the Multislider sequencer by one step on the right channel only. We achieve this by turning on the offset parameter. In this video we have seen many different parameters, but they had one thing in common. They are all arbitrary, meaning that they will perform the exact operation we have in mind. However, we've just scratched the surface of what WOV can actually do. It features other controls that are way more unpredictable and can add a lot of spice to our composition. We'll talk about response, variation and silence in the next episodes of this series. So if you want to know more, or if you just found this video useful, please consider subscribing to our channel and keeping in touch with us.